we are delighted to welcome Martin Beckmann from the University of Freiburg in Germany. And we'd be most grateful if you could turn off the cameras and mute yourselves during the talk. And also we're planning to record this talk, so please, if you want to ask some questions at the end of the talk and you don't want to appear on the video recording, please let us know. Any more announcements? Yeah, the talk will last 45 minutes and will take questions and answers at the end of the talk. And now I will pass on to introduce our speaker. Martin Beckmann, I hope I'm pronouncing it well, is a research fellow and lecturer at the History Department of the University of Freiburg in Germany. His research and teaching deals with the economic and environmental history of Europe since the 19th century in its global context, and with the history of international organizations and with aspects of the contemporary history of knowledge and science. He recently published a monograph examining the genesis of the international economic statistics from 1850 to 1950 within the context of and the history of the globalization. And his first book dealt with debates on forest decline in Germany from the 1890s to the 1970s, from the perspective of the history of knowledge and environmental history. Other recent publications include a special issue on the early history of the International Statistical Institute and an essay collection on the history of the concept of ecological modernization since the 1970s. Currently, Martin is working on two large projects. One is looking at research cooperation between socialist countries within the framework of the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance in the 1970s and 1980s. And he is also working on the history of Europe's industrial timber industry in the long 20th century from an entangled economic environmental history perspective. Today's talk will be on the international to world economic statistics from 1850s to 1950s. And as I said, Martin will be happy to take questions after his talk. Without further ado, Martin, I'll let you tell us all about your work. Thanks very much.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Unfortunately, my internet connection went down when you introduced me. I hope this won't happen during my talk, but we will see. I will share my PowerPoint slide, what I prepared for you, and I hope this works as well. Can you please let me know whether you see this or not?
Perfect. Yes, I can see you now, but I can't see you sharing anything yet, but I can see your face now, which was sort of...
Okay, you see my face, but can you see also the PowerPoint presentation?
No, I can't see your screen now, no.
Okay.
Not yet. Are you sharing?
Okay, but maybe now.
Yes, now I'm starting to say yes. Perfect.
Okay.
That's it. Thanks very much, Martin.
Yeah, fine. So again, thank you for the introduction, which I couldn't listen to, but thank you once again for inviting me to this group. So I have to say I'm not only happy, but I'm also a bit excited about giving this talk, because this is a bit of meeting history, so to say, or meeting one of my main sources, so to say, speaking in front of the Royal Statistical Society. As you will hear later in the talk, in the paper, you will notice that not only did the RSS play a big role in my research and also in the genesis of international economic statistics, so the object I studied, but I myself worked a lot with the material from the RSS. So of course with the journal, but I was also at the premises of the RSS in London and looked through some of the material there. So, and of course I met, so to say, a lot of people working within the RSS. So now being able to speak within this organization, this society. Yeah, this is quite interesting for me as an historian. However, what I'd like to do today is to present some of the findings and some hypotheses of my recently finished research project. And this project, now, this project was on the history of, or of the emergence and the genesis of international economic statistics from around the mid-19th to the mid-20th centuries. And what you can see here on this slide is the title page of my recently published book. As you can see, it is written in German and it was published in German. But fortunately, it is accessible open access by open access. So, and I hope this will help to spread the information of this book further than if it would have been printed only. So on the other side, you can see the title page of the European Review of History, issue number 1 of this year. This is a special issue I edited, and as you can see from the title there, this is about the early history of the International Statistical Institute. When I began this project, I was a bit puzzled that there are actually not much historical research on the RSI and its history and its role in establishing international statistics. So, and together with several colleagues, I put together this issue, and yes, again, it came out earlier this year, and you might have access to it as well. So, what I was interested in my project were mainly 2 questions. The first question was which actors tried to make the world or the world economy, economic phenomena in the world, countable and calculatable. When and why did this take place, and by what means did these actors make the world countable? And the second question was, what did this do? So this making the world countable, what did this do to the understanding of the contemporaries' understanding of the world, and also of international or even global economic phenomena, economic entanglements, so to say. So how did the worldviews change due to the emergence of international economic statistics? And to consider these both questions led very quickly to the history of the League of Nations and the role of the League of Nations in the establishment of international economic statistics. When I began the project around 10 years ago or so, the state of knowledge on this topic, on the role of the League of Nations in this whole story, was a bit contradictory, I would say. On the one side, there were interpretations like that of Eric Hobsbawm. In his seminal Age of Extremes, 30 years ago it appeared, he testified the League of Nations to have been, this is a quote, an almost total failure. Only in one regard, Hobsbawm maintained the Geneva-based organization had achieved something, and that was the collection of statistics. Whereas the first part of Hobsbawm's claim has become outdated by now, because there were so many historians working on the League during the last, I would say, 20 to 30 years, that it can't be held anymore, this claim that it achieved nothing. The second part of Hobsbawm's claim, though, this is still upheld, so that that statistical work was seminal. Scholars like Patricia Clevin, David Ekblad, Susan Patterson, or Sarah Steiner, they all underline that particularly the League's activities in economic statistics have been, quote, pioneering and path-breaking. For the first time in history, they stress the League's international economic statistics have visualized an interdependent single world economy, which could then become an object of political, of scientific, but also of public concern. Especially the 1930s, some of the historians claim, have witnessed the emergence of a world of numbers, a world whose image was increasingly shaped by the interplay of statisticians and economists who tried to describe and also to explain the Great Depression. And of course, this cannot be denied if one looks, for example, at quite iconic graphs like this one coming from the League. This one shows, as the title says, that the contracting of world trade, of the volume of world trade between 1929 and 1933. This graph was based on the monthly updated trade figures from more than 40 states of all continents. And together with many other graphs, with many other tables and numbers that contemporaries could read and see in their daily newspapers, it certainly had a major impact on how they perceived and how they reacted to the Great Depression. And it certainly also increased the demand for more and for more regular numbers on the world's economic situation and economic performance. However, none of the historians I mentioned earlier had explained what they actually meant when they characterized the League as having been pioneering. And they also did not explain why the League had achieved its leading role in this field. After all, in the 1920s and 30s, the League was not at all the only institution or actor that produced international economic statistics. Furthermore, the research gap, so explaining why the League was so successful and what actually pioneering meant, this research gap could also lead to confusion, and it led to my confusion, if one contextualized these characterization of the League to the longer history of international economic statistics or international statistics more generally. On the one hand, there certainly was no lack of international economic statistics before the First World War, so before the League came into being. Contemporaries of the late 19th century, they were, of course, able to compare economic activities of individual countries to each other, and they were also able to discuss aspects of what they then called, for example, international economic system. So for me, the question arose, what distinguished the League's statistical activities and the data from older endeavors, from older figures, tables, and graphs? On the other hand, in recent years, so meaning the last 15 years now, numerous studies have focused on the emergence of modern national accounting as the main framework to measure the economic performance of individual countries. And they also focused very much on the statistical activities of the United Nations and other international organizations. From their perspective, taking into view, of course, mainly the decades after the 1940s, the League's work appears as having not been much more than a precursor. It resulted, as the author of one of these studies claimed, in not more than, this is again a quote, collections of large data sets produced with little internal, much less international consistency. Others insist that international economic statistics before the mid-20th century could hardly be called global in the sense of the word. Again, if one wants to assess the League's relevance in the field, one has to ask how its activities can be related, properly related to such views. And this is what I mainly did in my project. Today, I will present some of the findings, as I already said, some of my findings in a nutshell. In the first part of the paper, I sketch out what international economic statistics characterized, how they can be characterized in the 19th century. Afterwards, I explain to what extent the League of Nations statistical activities actually were pioneering. I argue, very shortly, I argue that the League established an unprecedented statistical machinery, which has been continued and developed by the United Nations ever since. And it was this machinery which made it possible to simultaneously create and observe the world economy in a way that influences our views until today. And this is what I call world economic statistics, meaning a special kind of international economic statistics. In the third part of the paper, I present 4 reasons for the League's successes. These reasons suggest that the probably most important driving force behind this development was a growing willingness and also a growing need of governments to compete with each other by means of statistics. And these reasons also show or suggest that how close the increasing nationalisms of this time, so 1920s and 30s, and international cooperation were entangled. You all certainly know that the 19th century was a period of statistical enthusiasm in most of the Western states. And maybe a short comment on what I mean by Western countries. This has nothing to do. This is not a programmatic term I use. It is just to summarize mainly Central European states or societies, including Italy, Western European states, the United States, and the British Dominions. So in these societies, statistical authorities and societies were established, including the RSS, periodicals flourished, and the international exchange of ideas and data became an important way to generate and to disseminate knowledge on other countries and the world. Although some official agencies and increasingly also international organizations began to establish international economic statistics, private actors proved to be the most important players in the field. Especially German and British liberals began to collect and collate data from as many countries as possible and to publish them in annual comparative tables or in monographs. And some of them you can see here on this slide. So for very popular and internationally renowned publications. I would like to give you two outstanding examples of these British and German enthusiasts, as I call them. The first one is the German Otto Hübner. He was born in 1818 and he became emergent, a publicist, and a well-known, in Germany, a well-known political liberal activist who was also engaged in the 1848 revolution. From this time onwards, meaning from the mid-1840s onwards, he strived for the establishment of German statistics in order to support the German national cause. So in order to give contemporaries an idea what characterizes the German nation, the German people. More important for my interests, however, was Hübner's engagement in international statistics. He attended almost all of the international statistical congresses, which took place between the 1850s and 1870s. And in 1851, he established an annual publication that continued until the Second World War, so long after his death. And this was Hübner's Statistische Tafel aller Länder der Erde, so Hübner's statistical table of all the countries of the world. At the beginning, this table, which was printed on very large posters, informed readers about more than 90 states, and it was a kind of hybrid between pre-modern and modern forms of statistics. It comprised information on forms and heads of states and other worthy aspects, but it also contained information and data on, or quantitative data on population, on trade and state budgets. Hübner's table became very, very popular in German-speaking countries, but they were also sold in other countries in Europe, in North America, and even in South America and in East Asia. For example, the very first statistical publication in its modern form in Japan was a translation, a Japanese translation of a Dutch translation of Hübner's table. And as you can see, that it appeared already in 1860. So this is very important or very interesting to see, because if you have any sense of Japanese history, you will note that this was long before the so-called Meiji Restoration. So this was the event that turned Japan in this country of modernity that then conquered East Asia from the late 19th century onwards. But this was before, long before, and this was again a translation of Hübner's statistical table. That other publicists tried to copy Hübner's concept in their own languages, mainly in English, in French, and in Russian, that is no surprise, but none of them had the success Hübner's table witnessed. Leading German encyclopedias in the late 19th century therefore presented Hübner as the person who had popularized statistics in Germany. The same is certainly true for the second person I would like to introduce to you, and I think you will be more familiar with his name. This person was the Irish publicist Michael G. Mulhall. With his statistical publications on the progress of the world, the balance sheet of the world, and the industry and wealth of the nations, he popularized statistics in Britain, in Europe, and the Americas in a similar way than Hübner did in the German-speaking world. The most important and widespread of his publications, however, was the Dictionary of Statistics, which appeared in, I think it were 4 editions between 1884 and 1904. They became quite famous, not only because of the wealth of information they provided, but also because of quite innovative forms of illustrations of quantitative data. Contrary to Hübner's tables, Mulhall's books are still used today as sources of economic data for economic historians. His figures on national income per capita, for example, they were one of the first of its kind, and they are still cited in current literature. However, the international statistics Hübner, Mulhall, and their colleagues produced in the 19th century, meaning until the First World War, they shared characteristics that made them certainly informative, but not very useful in a functional way. First, they were a collection of already published country-related data. The presented information was therefore often outdated and hardly comparable to each other. Second, international statistical publications were dependent on the enthusiasm and the dedication of the involved actors, as well as on the availability of sources. When authors lost interest or funding, or when they died, their statistics often disappeared as well. Third, these statistics were mainly concentrated on Western countries, and if not, there often was a clear gap in terms of timeliness and content between the numbers from Western countries and figures from non-Western regions. And lastly, although statisticians, including Hübner and Mulhall, were at the forefront of those who since the mid-19th century had striven for an international standardization of concepts and methods, they hardly had any success. And this in turn complicated, of course, the collection, the collation, the comparison, and the summation of statistical data, of numbers. This changed only during the First World War. The necessity to pool their economic resources during the last month of the war, mainly in 1918, forced the governments of the Allied powers to establish a rudimentary border-crossing statistical infrastructure. Within the so-called Allied Maritime Transport Council, this was a body founded in early 1918 by the Allied governments. They even established in June 1918 a so-called non-national statistical bureau with a seat in London. However, this infrastructure, as you can imagine, came hardly into being before the war ended a couple of weeks later. But many of the officials who were responsible for the build-up of this AMTC, they became also leading figures in the league, in the early league. Of those you can see here on the slide, this was the case with Arthur Salter from Britain, with Jean Monnet from France, and with Bernardo Attolico from Italy. And it was especially Arthur Salter from Britain, the first head of the League's economic and financial section, who was quite eager to transfer the statistical activities of the AMTC to the League. In turn, the head of the AMTC's Statistical Bureau, the American economist Joseph S. Davis, seems to have actively prepared this transfer in the first half of 1919. This is not entirely clear from the sources I have seen, but what is clear is that the AMTC's non-national bureau served as a model for the League's statistical machinery. And this machinery was established from the founding of the organization's secretariat in London in July 1919 onwards. The League's machinery consisted of 3 elements. First, There was an international statistical infrastructure with the potential to become global in the sense of the word. It was established in the early 1920s. It expanded successively until the Second World War, and it was overtaken in 1946 by the United Nations. So the United Nations did not found a statistical bureau and it did not establish statistical infrastructures. It took over this from the League of Nations. This infrastructure consisted of a center at the League Secretariat. This was first in London and from late 1920 onwards in Geneva. And this infrastructure also consisted of institutional and material networks, personal networks as well, that connected this center with statistical authorities, private bodies, and also individuals in practically all countries of the world. And this included member countries of the League, non-member countries of the League, and even politically dependent territories like colonies, protectorates, or mandate territories. Due to institutional rivalries, the League never had a formal statistical department. Very quickly, however, members of the Secretariat's economic and financial section established well-functioning working routines, including a sophisticated intra-sectional division of labor and modern data processing facilities. From 1920 onwards, these routines enabled the section to collect very diverse statistical data from an increasing number of, how they called it, statistical areas, to analyze and to collate this data according to their own purposes, and to publish monographs, a monthly bulletin of statistics, and several yearbooks on economic conditions of individual countries, of continents, and of the world. So from the mid-1920s onwards, the world was in the center of interest for the League. The networks connecting Geneva with institutions on all continents made it possible to arrange the flow of data to Geneva in an unprecedented frequency and speed. Likewise, the League's highly professional information and distribution sections used exactly the same networks to advertise and disseminate publications in many parts of the world. What in the 1920s and 30s was said about international economic interdependencies and the world economy was to an increasing degree based on material coming from Geneva. The networks, they had often a formal character, meaning that the Secretariat organized an exchange of publications and data with state institutions. But these networks very often had also were also of an informal nature. And this was particularly the case when it was impossible to establish such official exchanges. This was the case, for example, in regard to the Soviet Union in the 1920s and to National Socialist Germany in the 1930s. Partly, however, such informal connections, such informal networks were even necessary to get relevant data from countries like Great Britain and the United States, especially in the early 1920s. Second, from 1922 onwards, the League's statistical machinery also encompassed bodies leading the international standardization of concepts and methods. Different from the similar endeavors of preceding decades, the League's effort was very successful until the beginning of the Second World War. And in addition to national systems, the basis of a globally uniform system to statistically observe production, trade, consumption, prices, and economic activity more generally was established. It is this system that the United Nations and other bodies, the IMF, for example, have gradually extended and revised ever since. A first body was an expert committee established as a result of the Economic Conference of Genoa in April 1922. The members of this so-called preparatory committee were nominated by the League's Economic Committee and the International Statistical Institute, the ISI. Although officially the committee was an independent body. Its work was mainly financed by the League, and it was to a large extent coordinated, prepared, and influenced by the League's chief statistician, Alexander Loveday, and his team. The body formulated a number of recommendations how national statistical authorities should collect, categorize, and publicly present statistics on foreign trade, on agricultural and industrial production, and the economic activity in general. In 1928, these recommendations served as the basis for a diplomatic conference organized by the League in Geneva. This meeting resulted in a legally binding international convention on economic statistics that is still in force today. Apart from a number of conceptual and methodological stipulations, the most important result of this meeting or of this convention was the establishment of a permanent committee of statistical experts. And this committee was meant to continue the standardization efforts. Since the League alone was made responsible for the work of this committee, it now, meaning from the late 20s onwards, was now not only a globally acknowledged institution to collect data from individual countries and to disseminate it all over the world, it also became the center where the rules were set how this data should be produced. The new committee began its work in 1931 and it finished it only in 1946. It formulated international standards concerning different aspects of statistics on foreign trade, on industrial production, on finance and banking, and maybe most famously on national income and accounting. And these rules were taken by the Statistical Commission of the United Nations from 1946 onwards, and they revised it, or they have revised them ever since. The third part of the League statistical machinery was the continuous and increasingly intensive involvement of the Secretariat in political deliberations on economic policy, as well as in academic debates on economics. I only mention here the economic conferences organized by the League of Brussels in 1920, of Geneva in 1927, and of London in 1933. I also refer to the financial stabilization efforts of the League in East Central Europe in the 1920s, and also to the biannual congresses of the International Chamber of Commerce that took place after 1921. Also, the work of leading economists in Geneva during the 1930s must be mentioned, which led to pioneering studies on the nature of business cycles and their international dependencies. And the Prosperity and Depression by Gottfried Haberle, which you can see here on the slide, is one of the most famous coming out of this work in Geneva. The League's involvement in these debates, they were important for its statistical activities because of two reasons. On the one side, Loveday and his team, responsible for the factual preparation of the events, were not only meant to provide understandable material for statistical and economic laymen, they also wanted to prepare digested intelligence rather than pure numbers. And that forced them to orient their work towards and to continuously adapt their studies to the needs of politicians, civil servants, journalists, and businessmen. On the other side, the close contact to the academic world, especially its Anglo-Saxon part, helped to produce and develop statistics according to the state of the art. So, having sketched out now what the pioneering character of the League's statistical activities actually meant, it now remains to ask why it could obtain it. In 1919, it was by no means clear that this would happen. There was a number of other international organizations which not only could have, but which also wanted to play a larger role in international statistics. From the summer of 1919 to the spring of 1921, several international bodies therefore struggled over the question which of them should become the leading institution in the field. The League was involved, of course, but also the International Institute for Agriculture in Rome, the International Bureau for Trade Statistics. This was an institution established in 1913 by an international treaty. And involved was also a privately organized International Trade Institute, also located in Brussels. The most important competitor for the League, however, was the Permanent Bureau of the International Statistical Institute with a seat in The Hague. This was a quite small office, also founded only in 1913, and there were only 2 unpaid staff members in this bureau. But this Permanent Bureau of the ISI based its alleged relevance on the global network of the ISI's more than 150 highly esteemed members from all continents. In the discussion about the future institutional organization of international statistics, the ISI got the strongest support from officials from France, Belgium, and Italy. And this reflected the quite francophone and francophile character of the ISI at this time. British, Canadian, and American experts instead, they backed the League's secretariat. In the end, the League succeeded, although its officials could, as I already mentioned, never realize their original plan to establish a distinct statistical office within the secretariat. And this, so to say, this was the compromise which was deliberated about during this fierce power struggle. So why did this happen? Why did the League succeed? After all, neither its political fathers in 1919 had foreseen a role for the League as a statistical institution, nor did its statutes prescribe it. And given the fierce resistance from an already existing and widely acknowledged institution, the League's career was rather unlikely. I propose to distinguish 4 main reasons for the League's successes. The first 2 of them are of a more domestic and the latter 2 of a more external character. First, the League obtained the position of the world's main center of international economic statistics because of the very close collaboration between the early secretariat and British actors, meaning British government, British academia, but also British businesses and business associations. The British Board of Trade, you certainly know this, the British Board of Trade had established a vast statistical infrastructure since the 1830s. By the early 20th century, it had become the world's leading publisher of official economic statistics from a large number of countries. The allied war bodies, to which I referred earlier, were therefore not only located in London, but they also profited from the already existing networks of the Board of Trade. In 1919, the governments of the Allied powers then decided to publish an international monthly bulletin of statistics together after the British Board of Trade had edited a pilot issue. And the title page you can see here. And this is a publication which is still existing. Now it is published by the United Nations. Furthermore, all the officials of the early Secretariat's economic and financial section had been working in the British administration during the war, and they now made much use of their formal and informal connections into post-war governments, into the private businesses, and into academia. Also, and maybe very importantly, their membership in the Royal Statistical Society or their contacts to members of the RSS was very significant for the League's success. Until 1940, the League Secretariat sustained a small branch office in London, whose head was the long-time RSS member Dorothy Pauline Ettlinger. Without her frequent use of the Society's library, many of the League's statistical publications would not have been as complete and timely as they actually were. Second, the statistical work of the League Secretariat was dominated by few, but highly competent and dedicated economists and statisticians who hold their positions for often quite a long time, partly even for the whole lifetime of the League. Their long-lasting services enabled them to acquire the relevant statistical know-how, and also to establish long-lasting formal and informal contacts to colleagues across the globe. This was very crucial for a real-time observation of economic processes, but also for the standardization efforts. Alexander Loveday, the head of the group, entered the secretariat on 1st July 1919, and he left it only in April 1946. So he actually was present for the whole lifetime of the League. Grzegorz Frumkin, John H. Chapman, and Ansgar Rosenborg, who also served the League until the end of its existence, had joined Loveday's team in the spring of 1921 after the League was given the task to publish the monthly Bulletin of Statistics. Already a year before, Per Jacobson, a later director of the IMF, and this already mentioned Dorothy Pauline Ettlinger had been hired in order to statistically prepare the Brussels Financial Conference. Jacobson stayed in Geneva until 1928, and Ettlinger headed her team of 3 women in the London office until 1940. During the 1920s, as you can see here on the slide, the group was strengthened by several other quite long-serving officials who partly or mainly contributed to the statistical work. I only want to highlight Gerhard Fürst from Germany. He entered, as you can see, in 1929, coming from the German statistical office, the Statistisches Reichsamt, and he was very crucial to uphold the informal connections to National Socialist Germany. So after 1933, when the German government pulled out of the official work with the League. But of course, the League was interested in what happened in Germany, and they tried to cover it as good as it was possible. And also vice versa. Germany was interested in how the League collected statistics and how the standardization work went ahead. And Gerhard Fürst was a very important person of liaison between the two institutions. In addition to these senior officers, also a number of statistical clerks worked in Geneva for many, many years, and they also stabilized, of course, the working routines. Third, the League's statistical activities profited from the emergence of new and the further development of already existing data, data processing and archiving technologies. The 1920s, you certainly know this, was a decade in which rationalization of almost everything was a paramount goal. Mechanical tabulators and semi-electronic punch card systems, as well as new hanging files and index card systems, they all facilitated the processing, the recollating, and the analysis of huge masses of data. The League's archives give many hints towards the significance of these new knowledge management systems. The often high expenses for their purchase or for their leasing, they were legitimized towards the League's treasurer by highlighting the costs for further clerks that would become necessary if the technical devices would not be acquired. In addition, the availability of well-working telegraph connections in faraway countries was very important to hold the League's monthly bulletin up to date. Loveday and his team, they built up a certain system of electronic data transfers that minimized costs without losing content. And last but not least, the improvement of printing techniques allowed it to make use of graphs and diagrams, which increased the accessibility of statistical data for readers everywhere. And vice versa, this again increased the demand for such numbers. The fourth, and I think by far the most important aspect, however, is that the League's successes were highly dependent on the capability and even more the willingness of governments to collect and to present statistics according to international standards. As numerous studies have already shown, the First World War was a central caesura in the history of economic statistics. Due to their involvement in economic activities during the war, governments of many countries had begun to hugely extend their own statistical machinery after 1914. They did not dismantle it after the conflict because of the many domestic and international economic problems they were faced with then, and also because of the social difficulties which were almost unknown to them before the war. Statistics were then seen as the best means to describe and to understand these problems, and also to determine ways for mitigating them. For the League, the existence of official statistical machineries was very crucial, because the better they were and the more legal power they had, the better the League services could be. However, the best governmental statistical office would not have helped the League if there had not been an increased willingness of states to cooperate with it, and to cooperate also with each other. Also, governments had to agree to apply international standards. And it was exactly this lack of this willingness that prohibited the emergence of world economic statistics before the First World War, before the 1920s. After the war, instead, this willingness emerged because there was, a bit paradoxically, an increased will of governments to compete with each other by means of statistics. And this competition took place or occurred on several levels. The existence of an official statistical machinery, according to Western models, signified a modern state. The visibility in international tables became a most important objective for so-called younger states in East Central Europe, and for mainly agrarian and extra-European states like Turkey or China, and even for some colonial countries like India and British Malaya. And this is reflected in the quote which I highlighted here on the slide, which is from a report of the Indian delegate to this 1928 statistical conference of the League. Governments of industrialized states, mainly in the West, they were interested in getting reliable, comparable, and up-to-date data from other states as cheap and as quick as possible via the international body. After the war, this was much more important for them because they wanted to diminish the uncertainty of a fundamentally changed international economic development. Governments needed that information to prepare for trade negotiations and international conferences, and also businessmen were interested in such numbers because they used it for planning their purchases, their production, and their distribution. In conclusion, I would stress that the League's activities in the field of economic statistics were pioneering because it succeeded in establishing, for the first time in history, a well-working and a still existing global statistical infrastructure and relatively effective bodies to internationally standardize concepts and methods. This machinery was based on highly dedicated and well-educated staff members who established formal and informal, in any case, excellent working connections to colleagues all over the world. It also was based on several technical developments, and most importantly, on the increasing will of state governments to compete with each other. Put in the center of the emerging international statistical infrastructure, the League had a considerable role in creating a new form of international economic statistics, which I already said this, which I call world economic statistics. World economic statistics differed in a number of ways from the older form of international economic statistics, especially because of their larger geographical scope, a higher frequency, and a better comparability of numbers. These new statistics helped to stabilize in the public debate, to stabilize the notion of what has been called world economy ever since. That is, a system of statistical indicators on production, on trade, on prices and consumption. The statistical representation of what happened during the late 1920s and early 1930s depended to a large degree on the League's machinery. Turning this finding around, one could argue, and I do so in my book, that the perception of and the reaction to the Great Depression would have been rather different if the League of Nations would not have built up its statistical infrastructure in the preceding decade. So the Great Crisis certainly served as a catalyst for the development and improvement of international economic statistics, but it certainly was not at its inception, as so many studies have hitherto claimed. And with this, I end this talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Martin. That's been a fascinating talk, and I must admit I didn't know much of that history, and I'm just very interested in going and reading all your publications on this. So, without further ado, I will open the floor to questions. If people want to either raise their hand or share their questions on the chat, I'll be happy to take those. And I think I have many questions like that, so I could probably start with a more general question. So I think for me it's been really revealing how much of these efforts started from a small effort. These individuals starting big efforts to put together all these communities, big international communities. I was wondering if there are still lessons to be learned for these original pioneers and how to coordinate international efforts on setting world statistics and yeah, dealing with all these competing interests of countries and so on.
I'm not so much in the practice of statistics, of collecting and disseminating international statistics in the present. So I'm not really sure what can be learned. So, and as a historian, of course, I have to say you cannot really learn from the history. But I can tell you what I found very interesting when I engaged in this project. So, and this was how big how big the importance was of very good informal connections between the involved actors. I mentioned the informal connections to Soviet Russia in the 1920s, and this is a very nice case where we can see it, because of course there were no connections, no official connection, and no one wanted an official connection between Moscow and Geneva. But already in 1922, a bureau for refugees, the Nansen Bureau for Refugees in Moscow, they had an office in Moscow, and via this office, publications on the economic situation in Russia were sent for a fee to Geneva, and they could make use of it. And in addition to this, 1922, 1923, there even was established an informal formal connection between Alexander Loveday, the head of the League statisticians, and the head of the Central Statistical Institution in Moscow. So of course this could not be formal, yeah. But no. both of these men had met at the first post-war conference of the ISI. This was 1923 in I can't remember where it was, but in 1923. And it seems from the correspondence I've seen that they liked each other and that both were of the opinion that they should have contacts. But again, they also agreed this could not be official. Yeah, and that's why they established their informal ways. This became better in the later 1920s. The Soviets already sent a delegation to the 1928 conference, although it was not yet a member of the League. And they cooperated, as other people said, quite constructively during this deliberation. So this was interesting to see how important informal connections were. And another comment on this, I mentioned it in the talk that even to a country like Great Britain, or in a country like Great Britain, it was important that informal connections existed, informal networks. And this, in the case of Great Britain, it was important to get up-to-date data from London to Geneva in order to hold the monthly bulletin of statistics up to date. And the problem was in this case that the communication had to go over official ways, meaning that the League Secretariat contacted, I think it was the Cabinet Office, and the Cabinet Office then transferred inquiries to the Board of Trade's Statistical Office. And of course, this would take its time. And both the Board of Trade statisticians and the statisticians in Geneva, who were almost friends, I would say, they used this informal ways to get the numbers on a more quicker way. Yeah, at least in the beginning of the 1920s, 1920, 1921, and so on.
Perfect. That's very interesting. This importance of trust and reliance on informal connections. There's a question from Tom. I don't know if you want to ask it yourself, or I'm happy to ask it. So,
I was interested. You get to the end of the league. Do you hear me? Okay.
Yeah.
Yes. At the point of the 1946, people are thinking about human rights. And obviously, this idea of collecting statistics is very important for understanding the state of the nation and people, but it also has relations to their privacy. And I wondered if the statisticians had any link into what came out of the Universal Declaration, which I think was 1948, because actually that's a very good foundation for what we do in statistics now. And I've always wondered why it was so well constructed in this way, because I hadn't realized statisticians were quite so well represented at this stage. Do you know anything about this, or is that outside the scope of your work?
It is, unfortunately. I have no idea whatsoever whether they had any hand in it. And this has also to do that I was really interested in this economic and financial section, and their work on economic statistics. I have no idea whatsoever whether they were involved in such kinds of the preparation of the Human Rights Declaration. I can imagine this, that people like Ansgar Rosenburg, but also Grzegorz Frumkin, which I mentioned in the talk, they not only were at the League services until its end, until 1946, but they also just changed to the United Nations. And Grzegorz Frumkin was engaged in demographic statistics as well. And coming from Poland, he was also, as far as I remember, maybe this is wrong, but I think I remember it, that he was involved in some kind of help for refugees from Eastern Europe in the late 1940s. And maybe they had a hand in it. Whether or not, I do not know, and whether this had to do with their statistical work for the League, I do not know either. I'm sorry that I cannot really answer this question, but it is an interesting aspect. I've never thought about it.
Oh, yes, Paul.
Thanks, Martin. That was a fascinating talk. I'm really interested in the development of the statistics that kind of a level below what you're talking about, I think. So I'm probably going to ask one of those terrible questions you don't know the answer to as well. But you were arguing that the statistics that were compiled were more comparable than what came before in the 19th century. But was there any way in which the methods, the processes for gathering those statistics were harmonized or tried to be done in similar ways in different places, or possibly even just set up in countries that didn't have them before as part of this process?
Yeah, thank you for this question. There are several answers to this, I think. What how I characterized statistical collections, or a collection of statistical data, so to say, in the 19th century, it was actually what I said. They took publications and tried to make these numbers comparable. If you look, at least in some of the publications, you have always such footnotes that basically say, don't take this too serious. But because there are the problems of comparability. But in the end, readers did take them seriously, and in some cases, they take them serious until today. What changed with this AMTC Statistical Bureau and then with the League was the way how they collected the data. To give you an impression from what Loveday and his team actually did from the early 20s onwards, they filled in their tables. So they had tables with the aspects they wanted to know, and then they filled in the information they already had for the individual states. And then they sent this questionnaire to individual countries, and they asked, is this true or not? And this was a much quicker way to fill out these tables than it was before. And also they got the information they wanted and not the information the governments wanted to share. Of course, some governments did not react. Some of them obviously had no idea what to fill in. Such things happened, but the approach was different. Yeah. And I think that this is a great difference. And I think what I've seen from the archival material, this technique of collecting the data from individual states, this was institutionalized over time. Unfortunately, from the sources I know, that there was a huge cabinet holding more than 20,000 index cards in the late 1930s. And these index cards included all the information on contact persons, on the ways how the individual states or bodies collected the statistics, how their methods were, and so on and so on. And these index card collection in 1945, I think, was sent to New York, 1946, sent to New York. And this was so the beginning of the statistical work of the United Nations Statistical Office. But neither in Geneva nor in New York is this cabinet anymore. So this was a kind of disappointing for me, because I wanted to know how they actually worked. Yeah. On the other side, and this is a third part for the answer, all the other ways to collect statistics, which already had been used in the 19th century, were used by the statisticians of the League as well. So, of course, they had a huge number of periodicals, trade journals, very specific journals from all over the world that were collected at the library in Geneva. And if any gap was there, they tried to fill it with such information. But very important here also for and reflecting the professionality of the League statisticians is that all of these gap-filling information was mentioned in the publication. Yeah, so that people could follow where is this information coming from. So this was also different from many of the publications from before.
That's very interesting that they took such painstaking efforts to be objective.
Yeah, and maybe still another comment on this. I mentioned this standardization efforts. So, and of course, the idea was to have this international level in which national statistical systems could be included. National systems were always much more differentiated, of course. I think this is the same today. And the idea was then to have this international system. And this standardization effort with its climax, so to say, in the 1920s, with this conference, with the setting up of this convention, still in force today, this was seen by many governments as a possibility to orient their work and their practices, their data collecting practices on these international standards. So this was seen as the standards, how it should be. Not every government followed everything. And only a handful, I think 30 or so, signed and ratified this convention until the beginning of the Second World War. But the practices which it included, this was seen as really the standard, how it should be. And one can see it, I've looked a bit on China and on India and on Soviet Russia. One could see there, especially in China, that they changed so there was also a change in government in the late 1920s in China, and they wanted to be seen as a modern country, as having a modern bureaucracy. And this could only be if you could prove that you can collect statistics according to these international standards. And then they changed an almost century-old system of how they collected trade statistics. From a quarterly publication system to a monthly publication system, and explicitly they said this is because we want to fulfill the League's conventions stipulations, although China never ratified this. Yeah, so in this we can see also in British Malaya, this is also a quite interesting case where the chief statistician of the colonial government corresponded with Geneva what he had to do to change his system. London was not very amused about this because this would mean that it would cost more money and so, and not so much came out of it, but the intention was there. And even, I do not remember, I think it was Fiji or something like that, so a very small colony, also there was a statistical officer who contacted the League and wanted to know how he should collect trade statistics. So that you can see, I call it in my book as a kind of magnet that becomes stronger and stronger over time, because everyone wanted and at some point had to apply these standards. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. That's great.
Any other questions? I have another one, but I have several. But I have a personal interest in the hidden histories of women in statistics, and I saw you mention 3 women in the London office of the National League. I was wondering, you talk about them as senior officers. Were they statisticians? Were they, or was this more a political role? Sorry if you probably explained it and I missed it.
I didn't understand the question correctly. You're
Sorry,
asking
so
whether
I heard you talking about Dorothy, Edlinger, Bodkin, and Brown, and these were 3 women in the London office of the National League. Did you mention?
Right.
And I wasn't sure whether these were senior officers. It was more of a political role, or was more of a statistical role, statistical duties, and so. Yeah,
they had no political role at all. This was only for statistical work.
Okay.
At this office, and I tried to find out, but I didn't. I actually do not know what Dorothy Adlinger, what kind of education she had, but she already was a member of the RSS in 1919. I think she was a mathematician or something like that, a mathematician, and the other 2 women, they were clerks, working as clerks. Okay. In this office, yeah, but the role of Adlinger is really crucial. So as I said, she made much use of the RSS library, but of course she also was the liaison person for getting information from banks in London, from governments which had no representation at Geneva or Paris, from individuals, from academia, and so on. So she was very, very important, and also the other 2 women there. Yeah, so they made very important calculations. So this is very interesting to see the very intense communication of numbers from London to Geneva every day. Several letters written and sent between these 2 towns. So yes, they were very crucial, but they had no political role at all.
Perfect. Okay, that's very useful to know, and I will probably contact you to learn more about them. Yes, and Yes, so there's a question. Yeah, if you want to speak further.
Hello, thank you for your lecture. First, please excuse I missed the first half an hour, so I've missed much useful information for sure. First of all, would you, I missed you have referred to your book, so can you tell me what is the book you have written? You have probably told the others, but would you please quickly tell me about your book?
Yeah, the book is actually about this, what I just told you. So, and it is written in German. I've shown the title page. Maybe later you can look it up when this video is loaded up. Then you can see it, or you look at my homepage. You will see the title, and it is about this history of international economic statistics between the mid-19th to mid-20th centuries, and how we can better understand the history of globalization processes. So this is mainly the topic.
Is it a manuscript, or have you published the book?
No, it is already published. It had appeared in spring of this year.
Okay, excellent. I will look for it. Then I have another question. You mentioned pointed out some core staff at the League of Nations working with the statistics, and I noticed one was Olavi Vojonmaa. He's a Finn. I'm interested. I'm writing an article on Finnish statistics. Okay. So can I find more information about Olavi? Can you tell me where I could find more information about Olavi Vojonmaa? Is it your book or where?
I inserted some information on him, but this is not very much I could find, but you can find his personal file in the League of Nations archives in Geneva. And I would say 99.9% of all the files of the League's archives is digitized by now, and also some of the personal files. So it would be very easy just to go to the web page of the archives, and you can have a full text search there and look for its name, for his name. If it is not digitized by now, you can just ask the staff members at the archives, and they will provide you with a personal file of him.
Excellent. Actually, I think that history of science is a topic for the future, because of this digitalization. It makes things very easy now, yes, much indeed. More easy. A third question is that you mentioned that there were Soviet statisticians kind of in personal contact with the League of Nations. So when was this, and would this have been from the Institute of Conjuncture in Moscow, which was a kind of a advanced institute for the study of business cycles, and I'm sure they had lots of interest. So yeah.
You are asking whether there were the contacts there?
Yeah, the Russian contactors, were they from this Institute of Conjuncture?
They had a first an informal exchange of publications, and towards, I think, 26 or so, I'm not that sure, they even made this official, so that they exchanged publications. Kondratiev was never at Geneva, as far as I know, but they exchanged letters. There are some letters between the Institute in Moscow and in Geneva, and of course it was difficult or sad to see in the sources that for quite a long time they did not know what happened after Kondratiev was put into prison in late 1920s. So they asked in Moscow what happened to the publications he wanted to send, and it did not get any answer. So, and then you see it in the monthly bulletin where these data coming from the institute were inserted. You see it in the monthly bulletin that subsequently information from the Soviet Union was taken out. Yeah. So, and this had to do, of course, with Stalinization in the Soviet Union. But in the 1920s, yes, there was this exchange.
Yeah, and then it died out, of course. Yeah, 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 almost literally.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.
Any more questions? I'll ask my final question in that case. So, is that a question about this information?
If you're not talking, please mute yourself, please. It's interfering.
Is that okay now?
Yeah.
No, you're still echoing. It's not you. Martin, can you mute yourself?
Yeah.
So, can you try again, Althea?
Oh yes, that's better. Thank you, Janina. Yes, so it's just a very small question, but it's just about whether there were any mechanisms to try with misinformation or some form of, I guess it has to do a bit with the harmonization or standardization or these footnotes that you were talking on how reliable statistics were across countries.
I'm sorry, I didn't get the question.
Oh, sorry. So it's just a question on generic, whether they had any mechanisms to ensure the reliability of all the statistics across countries. And
no, they didn't. So they cross-checked if they were able to cross-check. And Loveday was a very pedantic person. This I saw from the sources, but it is also said in several texts on him. And he was very eager to give correct data. But for example, in the case of the Soviet Union, as I said, the numbers went out of the publications in the late 1920s, but then the Soviet Union again came in after the country joined the League of Nations in 1934. But everyone was sure that these numbers were not correct, but they didn't have any other numbers. So, and as the Soviet Union was a member state, they had kind of the right to be inserted. So it is not stated in the publications that these numbers should be taken with how do you say it? They should not be taken too seriously. But within the machinery itself, within the Secretariat, it was quite clear that they were not that correct, because this can be seen from the communication between Loveday and the Soviet delegate at the League. That League complained about disparities and contradictions in the numbers sent from Moscow. And the delegate then said, "Oh, I'm sorry, I will check it," but it happened never. So, and this was a problem. But this was the most expressed criticism of Loveday against the Soviets, yeah, in an official way. Unofficially, he was quite clear that it's not correct, yeah. So again, there was no way of cross-checking if a government did not want this, yeah. But they tried to. They really tried to.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. Well, if there are other questions, I want to thank you again for a great talk. And yeah, I must say, I just look forward to an English version of the book. But yeah, I think Pera has a question again. So yes, if you want to speak, thank you.
Yes, hello. About a bit more about, this is not really a question. I tell that I recently studied or looked at a book of Soviet statistics published 1934. One of the statisticians creating this atlas was a Finn, a communist who had escaped to the Soviet Union, and he had become kind of a president of the Eastern Karelia autonomous, whatever this Soviet state would be, just east of Finland. My understanding is that the statistics were fairly kind of accurate, that he was trying to do the best with his colleagues. But the source I found the book from states that the Stalin thought that the book must be destroyed. So it's a very rare book, but one can find it from the National Library of Finland, and it's a beautiful book. It's a huge book, a huge atlas with lots of graphics and different kinds of statistics with beautiful colored graphs and the like. But also in this case, the Finnish statistician, on the long run, he was executed.
Thank you for this information.
Thank you again. And if there aren't any other questions, we look forward to reading about your interesting research. And thank you again for your time. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity to present this work. And yes, unfortunately, the book is in German. But as I said, it is available open access, and with the artificial intelligence programs, it might be quite easy to translate at least the sections you are interested in.
That's handy. Okay. To know.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Shirley, did you want to ask anything? No. Okay. Thank you. Right now.
Bye.